In the last segment, we saw that Hobbes thinks if there were no government, we would be in a war of all against all. And he thinks the war of all against all is about the worst thing you could imagine. It's just a bloodbath. Life would be solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes continues to describe what he thinks we would lose if we entered the war of all against all in this paragraph here. He talks about how there would be no real houses, no machinery, no heavy machinery, no instruments that can move things around, no agriculture, no free time, no arts, no literature, no real society, and a continual fear of dangerous and violent death. So it's not a good thing. The war of all against all is just about the worst thing you could imagine. In this segment, we'll consider what Hobbes takes to be the main objections to his argumentation and then his replies. There's really just one objection that he takes seriously, and it's this. Someone might just stare at him, offer the incredulous stare that we've talked about before, stare at him and say, why would you think the state of nature would be like that? Why would you think it's so brutal? They might elaborate and say, look, I think human beings are pretty decent. You seem to think that we're terrible. You seem to think that we'll just be at each other's throats the first chance we get. But maybe there's something in us that would make us get along. Well, Hobbes offers 3 replies. The first reply says that the objector should look at how she herself behaves. So, when taking a long journey, says Hobbes, you arm yourself and seek to go well accompanied. Now, this may not be as relevant today. Perhaps you don't arm yourself when taking a long journey. But maybe when walking around late at night, especially in an unfamiliar place, a big city, you might be a little careful to walk by, if you were going to go out by yourself, you might look for some company to go with you. And he says, when you go to sleep, you lock your doors. And even within your own house, you might lock some items up in a special place, like a chest. Well, he says, why do you do those things? We live in a society with government. We live in a society with a police force to enforce laws, to punish people who steal from us and prevent people from stealing from us, to punish people who harm us or mug us and prevent people from doing such things. Well, he says, if you take steps to avoid being robbed, to avoid being attacked, even though you live in a society that's set up to protect you, you must think terribly of your fellow humans. You must think that we're really despicable, lowly creatures. So, he says, you condemn human nature with your actions, no less than I do with my words. His second reply is based on what we call an empirical claim, a claim about what the actual facts in the world are. And his claim is very straightforward. He says, look, we live in a world where there are places that are in the war of all against all. That is, there are places that are in a state of nature, places without a government. And in those places, he claims, there is a war of all against all. So here's a quote. He says, there are many places where they live so now, meaning they live without government in a state of nature. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, there is no government at all. And people there live to this day in the brutish manner that I said before. So his claim here is pretty straightforward. He's saying that in places without a government, such as America, there is a war of all against all. Well, let's see if this claim is true. Here's Columbus talking about the natives he finds when he arrives in the Americas. He says they are so naive and free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. They bought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know of them. For I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron, their spears are made of cane. So, as Columbus is describing it, this place in the state of nature, this place with no government, doesn't sound so bad. It doesn't sound like the war of all against all. Quite the opposite. It sounds like a very peaceful, friendly kind of place. Now, what does Columbus the man who comes from a place with a king, the man who comes from a place with a formal government, think of these people? How does he react to their goodness? He says they would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Well, this doesn't speak well to Hobbes' empirical claim that when you don't have government, you end up in the war of all against all. You can take that for what it's worth. Hobbes' next reply to the objector is this. He says, look, there is no government between nations. So Britain has a government, France has a government, Prussia has a government, but there is no government that governs all of those together. There's no international government. And Hobbes says when you look at how nations behave in relation to one another, it's very bloody. They attack one another, they kill one another, and that's how individuals would behave in relation to one another if there weren't particular governments like the government of Britain and the government of France and so on and so forth. Again, you can take that for what it's worth. You might think that this doesn't apply so much these days because these days we have international law. There's two things to say about that. First, it's not really relevant to Hobbes' point because Hobbes is just saying, in my time, when there is no genuine international law, we can look at how nations behave and get a sense of how individuals would behave if there were no government. We see that nations behave very, very badly. There is, in effect, a war of all against all. That's how individuals would behave if there were no government. The second reason that the current existence of international law isn't especially relevant to Hobbes' point is that Hobbes doesn't think there currently is international law. Now, Hobbes is dead, so he's not thinking about now. What I mean is he wouldn't count the kind of laws that we have now as genuine laws. Why not? Because Hobbes thinks that you have genuine law only when you have a bludgeon, only when you have someone with the ability to enforce the law. And there is no bludgeon for international law. There is no international military that's more powerful than the militaries of individual nations. Okay, so that's the main objection Hobbes considers to his view that in the state of nature there would be a war of all against all, and those are his replies. You can take them for what they're worth. We'll now move on in the next segment to talking about what Hobbes has to say about what he calls the right of nature.